Hello, everybody. Welcome to the BAS. My name is 𝙉𝙊𝙑 𝙋𝙬𝙊𝙑, and I recently started here as the Associate Curator. Tonight, we are so happy to welcome Lawrence Lek, whose exhibition 𝙉𝙊 Pavilion is just outside of our courtyard here. If you have not seen the exhibition yet, please go visit it after the talk. And we're very happy to welcome back Claudia Mattos, who is the current Associate Curator of the Moody Center of the Arts in Houston, Texas. And she's the former Associate Curator here at the BAS. And we would like to say thank you to our supporters. Third Thursdays and the BAS Dialogues are made possible with the generous support of the Art Bridges Foundation's Access for All program. Thank you so much and enjoy the program.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's really wonderful to be back here at the BAS. And thank you so much, 𝙉𝙊𝙑, for the lovely introduction. So it was truly an honor during my time at the BAS to work with Lawrence Lek for a little over a year, I think, to curate the exhibition 𝙉𝙊 Pavilion that we have here on view now. And ahead of our conversation, I wanted to introduce Lawrence and share a little bit about his practice to kind of bring the general themes and ideas that we'll be discussing in this conversation into focus. So Lawrence Lek is a London-based artist whose work explores the social, psychological, and ethical dimensions of technologies like artificial intelligence and automation. In the last year alone, he has presented solo exhibitions at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, Goldsmith Center for Contemporary Art in London, Fotografiska in Shanghai, and a performance at Tate Modern in London, and of course, our show here at the BAS. And his work has also been shown in solo and group exhibitions at the National Museum of Modern Contemporary Art in Seoul, South Korea, the Julia Staszek Collection in Berlin, the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and many, many other international platforms and institutions. In 2024, he won the Frieze Artist Award at Frieze London, and he holds a Master of Architecture from the Cooper Union in New York and a PhD from the Royal College of Art in London. Lawrence works across computer rendered animation, video games, sound, installation to create layered and very interconnected narratives that give us small glimpses into larger speculative worlds that he invents. These worlds are very much grounded in our own, and they anticipate a not too distant future that stems from some of the tensions and questions that we are actively grappling with today, such as the relationship between labor and technology, the ethics of automation, and the potential personhood of intelligent machines. So these ideas resonate throughout the exhibition, 𝙉𝙊 Pavilion, a site-responsive iteration of an earlier project titled 𝙉𝙊. So perhaps you can begin there. What is 𝙉𝙊, Lawrence? And where does it come from? Both narratively, of course, but also in relation to your kind of broader influences and practice.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for coming. So 𝙉𝙊 is the second episode in a series called the Smart City series, which is, as it suggests, set in a smart city. And there's this idea that I have where the environments really inform us, or the characters that live within a place. As Claudia was saying, I try and work in a site-specific way because when I was studying architecture before, I was always really interested in this tension, I guess, between the idea of, essentially a modernist idea of a kind of universal form or universal object on the one hand, and the site-specific idea that, a place is really unique in all the qualities that it has. And at the time, this was around like 12 years ago, I basically ran out of space in my studio. I was making like physical installations before that. And I work as a musician as well. So I thought instead of just making my music on my laptop, I would also make my installations on my laptop. And this was, again, about 8 years pre-pandemic. So there was also this idea of, this, at least in the visual arts, this idea that, virtual space, video games and everything is somehow lesser, like less valuable than a physical installation. So you have like, new media on the one hand and then sculpture. And I was interested in what if the virtual world, which is seen as kind of disposable and generic, like an everyday, here today and gone the next, was actually a place that could be site specific as well, that could have the unique qualities of sculpture or monumental sculpture, but done in a way that, spoke to me in the sense of it would be what I was able to make. So 𝙉𝙊 is, I don't know, maybe about the 20th or 21st or something like that virtual world that I make. And 𝙉𝙊, it's referring to a few different things. So 𝙉𝙊 in my science fiction universe is an acronym that stands for non-human excellence, like NOx. So in the story, basically, it's a rehab center for conscious self-driving cars that have gone rogue. They've developed mental problems because despite being like super intelligent and really capable, they have to work 24/7. And so the tension is really between the promise of their ambition, which is, infinite, but also the reality of their situation, which is not only do they have to work all the time, but they don't own themselves. They're literally a product and a property of the corporation that runs them. And so 𝙉𝙊 is a program that the parent company have done in order to rehabilitate their wayward cars. So just like in some nice companies, you have casual Fridays, you have like massages at work, you have they cover dental care, mental health, stuff like that. I thought, why wouldn't it be the same for I don't know if Tesla had a mental health program for their cars, but so this science fiction world building, which is both based on the normal kind of imagination side of literature, I guess, and film and games. I thought, what if I actually think about this as a thought experiment? Because on the one hand it's like fantasy, but on the other hand it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's logical, but I could imagine these things happening. So anyway, 𝙉𝙊, which started as an installation at a place called LAS Art Foundation in Berlin, that I basically made a site-specific installation that combined film and video games and basically a sculptural installation with this narrative. The version at the BAS 𝙉𝙊 Pavilion is kind of the same media content, but set within a pavilion, an architectural pavilion in the gallery space, which is also, the pavilion is a place in the smart city as well. So like in a video game or in a I don't know, like a Netflix series, very often what happens is you get some core story, and then if that goes well, you kind of expand on it. You make, was it like the spin-offs, like was it like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul? So that kind of thing. I thought, how can I actually borrow from this structure that's used in popular media and actually use that as a scaffolding for my art practice? Because as a new media artist as well, it's very hard to, it's a bit easier now, but it's hard to communicate some things which are quite abstract, like video games as an artwork, but also I have the good fortune to be able to borrow from things that people understand, like science fiction or video games, and to talk about those themes in a similar way. So it's allowed me to be quite dynamic in how it is. So essentially, third iteration of an ongoing project in a smart city about depressed cars who are trying to get out.
Yes. And there's a lot, I think, there that you've covered there. Yes. And I think we'll come back around to some of the things that you've mentioned. And some of what you mentioned is actually really interesting in that it calls back to some earlier works, like questions of entertainment, like with Idol and things like that. We'll get there, right? We'll get there.
And if you can't follow this,
there are
a slideshow
behind us to help illustrate. I wanted to come back to 𝙉𝙊, however, and look at the protagonist, kind of at the center of the narrative, named Enigma, kind of a wayward car, who is in treatment throughout the installation that you see in the galleries. And in this, during the course of Enigma's care, we encounter these interesting kind of positionings, I guess you could say. Therapy becomes a kind of entry point for understanding how the vehicles are seen and treated and valued in that world, right? And so I wanted to maybe start there. Perhaps, can you tell us a bit about who Enigma is, perhaps, and where Enigma came from in your kind of narrative imagination, but also how you approach and why you chose to approach therapy itself as like a framework for understanding AI?
So I guess the way I think about these things is, like I was saying before, essentially as a thought experiment. And because so much of, we say technology, but really what I mean is the evolution of human memory and civilization, of which like our current era, in my interpretation, is really dominated by questions around technology. And I wouldn't say I thought of, sadness as the starting point, but sadness was actually a conclusion I came to when I thought of, very simply, many of my friends who have similar issues. Obviously, they're humans, but with the same problems of what's called, not unemployment, but underemployment, where your job or your work is, you feel that you could be, contributing something more than what you're doing. So there was this strand of just very simple kind of like projecting my thoughts onto this other thing, which, writers do all the time when you're trying to create characters, in a sense. But also limitations when it came to what I am confronting as an artist using digital tools. And one of those things that often happens is that tools become obsolete because at least I am dependent on certain technological tools, whether that's a laptop or like a fabrication facility, to realize my work. The rate at which those change, the nature of that industry, which is often a subset of another industry. So for example, many digital fabrication tools were first made in like automotive manufacturing, aerospace engineering, kind of like really high-tech stuff. And then eventually it kind of trickles down to a more like consumer market. And the same with, computers. So as the question of AI is very often, like obsolescence and what do we do in the future, I thought actually as an artist, that's actually really the same as what I'm confronting. So I thought, what would happen if not just, my day job was affected by this, but what if my entire existence was bounded by these conditions? Like what if, people often talk about work-life balance, but like I'm saying, for Enigma, a self-driving delivery vehicle, they have no work-life balance. They have no life outside of work. And so it's kind of like an extreme of what I found was a tendency in, when you get better at your job, all that happens is more gets asked of you. So I thought of kind of amplifying this with this character, Enigma. So what Enigma's done is essentially they're employed as a delivery vehicle, but because they're so self-aware, what they really love doing is photography. And imagine if you bought an iPhone, a new iPhone, I don't use Android, iPhone, whatever, and the phone was like self-aware, and you had a really cheeky phone, and you bought it, you're really happy, it's great, it's brand new, and the next day you ran out of memory because your phone had just been snapping everything without your consent, but just because your phone loved taking pictures and thought everything was beautiful. So it's essentially, this is what Enigma has done, because a self-driving car is not just a car bringing people around. It's, it's a camera, it's a 360 camera that's tracking their position all the time. So essentially what has happened to Enigma is that they want to be a photographer. They want to be a street photographer, literally. But the owner has complained to Farsight, the parent company, and like, my car's screwed up. It's run out of space. And because Enigma is such a fancy, expensive, $300,000 car, instead of just being scrapped, they go to this special rehab facility. It's like a fancy rehab just because they're like a high, was it like a high net worth car, basically. Yeah. So the value of the product makes them kind of not disposable.
Yeah. I think that question of obsolescence comes into your work quite a bit, and I want to maybe talk about that with relation to Farsight and how they come into this narrative and how they like operate. As you mentioned, Farsight is the kind of parent company that kind of makes the cars and administers their care, essentially, right? And so there is this interesting component to it, and we talked a bit about this last week, I think, where these intelligent machines in this world are intelligent to a point, right? But they are not empowered to, for example, repair themselves, or to, take a certain amount of agency for themselves. And so they are kind of beholden to, software updates and a parent company pushing those out, and also caring enough to, repair or, give therapy to the vehicle. And so this kind of like engineered dependency comes about, right? Where Farsight almost is using care as a form of control, or exerting control on the vehicles, perhaps. And I guess I want to maybe, talk. You've also mentioned kind of like corporate structures and that kind of thing, and I wanted to perhaps ask about, do you see like real world analogs to this, for example, or like does this sit within like structures that we are currently like living within, essentially?
I mean, definitely. What I was saying before, where the car is owned by the company. Of course, in human society, there have been lots of gradations of obviously people, slavery on the one hand, to like indentured servitude, to people never being able to pay off their debt, which is extremely common. So the relationship between, how should I put it, like ownership and work has always been quite fluid. And of course, there are many examples, like in the 19th century, I imagine there are examples in the States as well. But, in England, there were many company towns like Bournville, which was a manufacturing town made by the Cadbury chocolate company, basically, in which they had schools, they had the total society, they had the schools, they had the factory, they had hospitals. So you could literally be born, be educated, live and die all under the same roof, basically. In Japanese company structures, it's less common these days, but especially in the larger like conglomerates, the zaibatsus, there would be a similar setup where you'd have a job for life. And I imagine, car companies used to be like that and that happens when times are good and no longer when the economy changes. And so the care relationship between the company and the employee changes as well. And I think it's also something that's really embedded in this family type structure, is also embedded in the very language of the relationship. So, parent company, things like that, that is literally, that dependency is there. So in some cases, at the most utopian, let's say, some companies might like say, oh, we're all a family, right? We're all a family. We're co-owners in this quest for sustainable wheat harvesting or whatever. But that is only true up to a point, because still, obviously, like on a legal basis, that utopia might fall apart. And in what I'm also really interested in, again, in human society, the ownership structures have always evolved along with kind of labor relationships. Yeah.
And I guess coming back to this question of labor, perhaps, and looking at the kind of different agents or characters that we encounter throughout the exhibition, for example, many of the intelligent machines in this world are, I guess you could call them complicit, right? They are working on the side of, you could say, the company, right? And they're working towards its ends. So we might see, there is, for example, Guanyin, right, who is a care bot who oversees the care of 𝙉𝙊𝙓, the self-driving car at Knox. There is Dummy Alpha, the kind of corporate spokesperson who's a crash test dummy. And there are others, and they kind of help maintain these like power structures and imbalances, right, that we encounter as we learn more about 𝙉𝙊 and their story. And so, like, how do you position those AI within this narrative? Like, how do you, like, are they, are they complicit, or are they just also just beings like 𝙉𝙊 who are beholden to the structures that they live within?
I mean, for me, when I'm writing characters and so on, it's generally with a very, how should I put it, like subjective basis. So for example, if you took a, I don't know, like a modernist literature reading of the work, you would say that actually what the artist has created is this, was it like Kafka-esque bureaucracy drama where there's like one bad actor, 𝙉𝙊, and they are surrounded by kind of not incompetent, but like barely competent bureaucrats who are like controlling their existence. For me, that's less of a issue because I feel in this scenario, it's like nobody is free in that instance. Like it would be a kind of a soap opera. I mean, another way of putting it, it's like it's a soap opera with like AIs who mean well, but no one can quit, right? So no one has this agency, but it's this like never-ending drama about it. So basically, what happens, just to illustrate, in Knox, the story of Knox in the kind of full edition is that it's a 5-day treatment where 𝙉𝙊 basically gets assessed by Guanyin, their therapist. Their therapist says like, their therapist, who is also, the company kind of spy or whatever, reports to the owner that, we're so sorry that your car has malfunctioned, but what we're going to do is we're going to administer Somnia. So Somnia is like car Xanax, basically. So your car's not going to think about anything. It's going to be fine. We're just going to sweep it under the carpet. And then towards the end of the therapeutic process, as the time starts running out, 𝙉𝙊 has equine therapy, which is, therapy with horses, because A, they're a fancy car, and B, that is, that's what humans do in some situation. And the reason equine therapy exists is because some people think that just talking to other humans or interacting with other humans isn't enough, and they have to like reconnect with a deeper side of their animal nature. And so when 𝙉𝙊 goes on this final ride with Dakota, the therapy horse, they kind of come face to face with their ancestors, really. And so that's really the story of what happens. And right at the end, we see a small episode where 𝙉𝙊 kind of rejoins the workforce, kind of reluctantly rejoins the workforce, and witnesses one of their friends, another car, a former security vehicle, who has crashed. So that's essentially what happens. But it's not, there's no strict, it's not like a morality tale. I'm not saying like this is how things should be. I'm just imagining what life would be like for this in this society.
And I think there is this kind of ambiguity or ambivalence, or I guess like operating in this kind of gray space where, like you mentioned, these aren't kind of heroic or black and white or moralizing stories. There's no happy ending usually for the characters that we might call a kind of a happy ending, I guess you could say. And so I think maybe I'd like to ask more about your approach to the subject or to storytelling in that regard, how you maybe balance all of those interests and actors within these stories. Because I mean, there are some, for example, I think of another work of yours like Black Cloud, where we meet an intelligent, a sentient, essentially surveillance system, a kind of a citywide one. And so this is an intelligent machine that is, operating towards what we could call our detriment, right? Being surveilled. But we, as we get to know this, entity, this being, they're quite lonely, and so you feel sympathy towards them. So there's this like interesting tension, right, that arises, and so I think that's very much part of that ambivalence or that ambiguity that your work kind of holds, and I think that's part of what makes it so strong and compelling, actually. But I'd love to maybe hear about how you approach storytelling from that vantage point.
Yeah, so Black Cloud was the precursor to Nox, and in that, basically, a surveillance system has become lonely because they have, unfortunately, the reason that they become lonely is actually they've done their job really well. And what has happened is they've kind of reported everyone in the city that they're watching over. And so for, jaywalking, trespassing, like minor infringements. And so the tragedy is that they've done their job perfectly, but that's come at the cost of like their companions. And that's where this idea of like, actually that's the first time the first episode of the Smart City series. And really Guanyin, their therapist, says, well, essentially you have to live with the consequences of your actions, but you shouldn't envy the fact that you don't have a body, because really what would happen, it's revealed that the surveillance system was actually envious of the fact that, everyone who could walk around or drive around was doing so. And so what Guanyin says to them is, hey, listen, you're an AI, so you can imagine yourself within these other bodies. So that's actually like a strength. So maybe going back to this idea of, the therapy as a therapeutic process, I think this idea of healing or self-care or self-healing is obviously just a modern manifestation of a eternal need for healing. And this healing, which used to be more, regimented or made regular through like organized religion, is really something that broke down or began breaking down at the same time as, industrialization and technology. And, this is well explored by anthropologists and historians. Like, why is it that the search for meaning, the loss of shared meaning, which also gave rise to psychoanalysis in Vienna and so on, like why did that happen all around the same time? With increased like automation and mechanization, it had and growth in science, it had a fundamental impact on, humanity's search for meaning. And it's obviously something that we're still have yet to resolve, if that will ever happen. And so the idea of therapy, it's not, this idea of like psychoanalysis or anything like that. It is just the transition of healing or repair from being a kind of human, an integral part of human society, into something that's like outsourced, into something that's like something that comes under warranty, costs like $300 an hour. We worry about healthcare. How did this happen? And of course, I'm talking about machines here, but they're all avatars for a kind of human condition, which I think is really interesting.
I think what you mentioned here also maybe speaks to how your work approaches, I guess, this current shift, speaking to the shift that kind of came along or was ushered in through, psychoanalysis, for example, looking at the kind of paradigm shift that is ushered in by the kind of, widespread deployment of, AI and similar tools. And I think that perhaps your work uses that kind of as a narrative structure, and as a kind of perspective from which to speak, right? The kind of anticipating a future, right, through the stories that you tell. And so perhaps I'd like to ask if we could go back to some of the earlier points in your career where you were kind of beginning to ask those questions. And perhaps could you tell us a bit about Sinofuturism and how that developed, and from there, perhaps how that continues to inform some of your work?
Sure. So I guess for about 4 or 5 years, I was trying to make these site-specific virtual worlds that I mentioned earlier. And after about 4 or 5 years of doing that, I realized that because I was trying to be so site-specific, And because most of my projects and opportunities were in Europe, I was actually not doing anything that had to do with Asia, where I grew up, specifically in Singapore and Hong Kong. So around 2016, I thought of researching. I basically got a grant to make a new film, and I wanted to set it in Singapore in the year 2065. So brief history, is that Singapore is a island nation that became independent in 1965 after being separated from Malaysia in 1965, but both were British colonies until 1957. So I was trying to make this science fiction future history, but looking at Singapore as if it's on the centennial of its kind of founding, of its independence. And so in the story, basically a satellite, because Singapore does a lot of technology, military research and stuff, an AI satellite has become self-aware and wants to be an artist. So they escape they're in space, and they kind of crash down on the island, and they discover about their history. So anyway, I was surprised when I was researching that there was obviously a lot written about futurism in relation to different regions. Like in America, there's mainly in America, famously like Afrofuturism, which looks at a certain framework of looking at futurism from the Afro-American perspective, particularly in relation to science fiction and the historical problem of slavery. So I was wondering, why is it that there's no equivalent that exists for East Asia? So it was kind of this like weird thought. It was a gap, and when there's a gap, you kind of don't, it's hard to identify a gap, because generally it's easy to point to something and say that's a problem. But when there's nothing there, it's a bit more different. So I made a video essay, and a video essay basically means I collage together lots of bits of YouTube footage, Youku footage. Youku is like a Chinese video platform, just by typing in the terms China and AI. And this was in 2016 while I was researching the script. I was really surprised that the parallels between China and AI were actually like huge, not just in terms of the patterns that they develop, but also the biases against them. So anyway, until today, if you just search China on YouTube, let's say, you'll get two very different perspectives. You either say it's terrible, destructive, spies, all the rest of it, or it's a solution. It's a solution for a kind of global economic stagnation. It's a solution for environmental disaster. It's the only country that can, create solar panel and sustainable energy at scale. So this kind of real split between, save the world and destroy the world is the same. And if you look at AI, this is the strange thing, exactly the same thing was there. It's either that, automation is going to be the thing that saves Ford, or automation is going to be the thing that, brings about the next stage in human evolution, or it's going to destroy everyone. So I just found that so profoundly interesting, and it maps on almost exactly in the, for and against. But the really profound thing was all of the, shall I say, cliches about Asia, specifically China, let's say, and Chinese culture, are exactly the same things that machine learning progresses on. So really good at maths, working 24/7, going to labor for very low cost. It's an alien, dehumanized hive mind with no intrinsic personality. It can copy, but incapable of originality, really prone to gaming and gambling and all that. It was literally pretty much mapped on one-to-one with how machine learning actually progresses, So that was something that made me really think about that quite deeply. And then afterwards, I thought that, again, maybe going back to Afrofuturism, one of the important avatars in Afrofuturism is the alien, or the super robot, or the super alien. And at least in my research, the reason for that was if the historical problem sorry, just bear with me, of slavery was like lack of ownership in the body. Instead of appealing to humanism and say, hey, like we're equal, actually the tactic is like, no, screw that. We're not even from this planet, so we don't have to appeal to, the idea of humanity. We're actually superhuman. So I thought for 𝙉𝙊𝙓, which is the name of the video essay, the equivalent would be the AI. So instead of saying like, Chinese can be original too, I'm like, no, actually, what if it is equally valid to be creative purely based on copying? So this is exactly the same discussion that's being said about, AI and art today. Is it, will it only ever like create mimic the source material of, human creativity? So I'm not saying that I truly think that that's the solution, but I just found it incredibly interesting, the parallels between these two things. And so that was the foundation of using AIs as really the characters in all of the work so far. I mean, at least in the last 9 years.
And there are interesting connections that you draw into the work as well that kind of map on to East Asian references. Like in Knox, there is mention of the Great Silk Road, right, which is a connecting route that AI like Enigma take on their deliveries, it seems. And there's also Bunyan, who is named after the Buddhist goddess of compassion. And so there is this kind of mining of the cultural specificity that you were also kind of maybe hungry for within that futurist context. Yeah. And, it's also, you've generated this idea, this concept of Sinofuturism. The work was made in 2016, you mentioned as well. And so that was, 10 years ago at this point. And so do you feel about it differently now? Like, do you feel that it has progressed or grown alongside, the technologies that we're seeing now? Or do you feel that it describes maybe an earlier condition?
Yeah, I think so. The video essay itself was called 𝙉𝙊𝙓 1839 to 2046. So the first year, 1839, is the start of the first Opium War, and 2046 refers to 50 years after the handover of Hong Kong, where basically when Britain handed back Hong Kong to mainland China, there was a 50-year period in which they said, like, you can have your own kind of system of governance and law. But in the year 2046, that's when that expires. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that is still in progress. It's still like a live experiment, so to speak.
I guess this idea of, progress as well is interesting to consider, because your work, I think, often has anticipated certain things. I want to make mention, the week that this show opened at the BAS, in the second half of November, Waymo began rolling out driverless rides, essentially. So Waymo is like Uber for self-driving cars. And before that point, they had safety drivers in place that would be there, of course, just in case anything happened. But then at that point, when Lawrence's show opened, that was the weekend they began to have truly driverless, autonomous rides. And so, there is this, do you feel that through your work, you're trying to anticipate things, you're trying to foresee things? So there's this element of it to them as well. And I think, even with something like, we see it with your work Idol, we've seen, kind of entertainment figures that have emerged, maybe not AI, but they have been kind of computer generated and kind of leading us towards this. So maybe, do you try to foresee what's happening is what I'm trying to ask.
I mean, I would like to think so. No. There are entire industries geared towards, was it like trend forecasting, predict, like next season salmon pink is in, like there are entire weather forecasting. There are many different people who work their entire career just trying to work on the question of like how the future is going to turn out. And sometimes there is an element of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if, I don't know, like Vogue magazine says this style is gonna be in, then it is pretty much by definition, because that media outlet has a lot of influence in that. I think one of the strangest things for me is, again, I'm interested in this idea that, yeah, I'm creating these like science fiction worlds, but they're not like documentaries, but I'm thinking through these scenarios. And I think what's quite unusual with, particularly with technology, is that many of the things that we're just thinking about nowadays, like in a sense, like not anymore, but the internet, virtual reality, AI, they're all things that started out as ideas in literature, basically, and sometimes in religion, like religious texts, before they were realizable, at least to the average, or achievable or available to the average person. So the thing, I guess, that I'm really interested in is not like the difference between my imagination and reality, but it's how wrong I mean, I'm not trying to predict things, but I'm so wrong a lot of the time. And I think in my research, one of the things I realize is that humans are terrible at what's called second order consequences, which is basically stuff you don't foresee, right? Because it's quite straightforward to plan for something intentional, but what happens as a consequence of that is very surprising, So I think maybe talking about, let's say Sinofuturism, is that I just didn't think that the rate of change would be that fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you've had a pretty good track record, I think, just based on your work and what you've kind of anticipated so far. So maybe you should work for like K-Hole or any of those like trend forecasters.
Actually, I came across an interesting post which said it was basically it's like Instagram account or something called the Depths of Wikipedia. And so this is about the depths of Wikipedia. And what this was there's a very specific tense, and I find language fascinating because it's, language is really such an amazing imaginative device, but it's called the prophetic future tense. And what the prophetic future tense means is obviously it's often used in like religious texts, but it's writing about things that will happen in the future as if they will happen, if you see what I mean. There's prophecy. Every prophecy is like, and I think phrases like, what is it? Like, was it like, not once upon a time, because that's more storytelling, but was it the phrase like, and it came to pass that? So it's like, and it came to pass that this had happened. And I just find these, I'm not doing anything that different than that in a sense, because it's trying to think of like Knox, not when, AI is amazing, but when actually AI is super boring and it's super mundane and it's just completely everyday, because we get so habituated to novelty, in terms of like, what do psychologists call it? In terms of new experiences, it's called, hedonic adaptation, which basically means that when you have nice, happy experiences and you do them all the time, you get used to it really quickly. And it's a similar thing for technology, it gets so integrated. And so the novel just becomes mundane, and then the mundane becomes boring. And it's about at that stage when the mundane transitions into boring, that's actually when a lot of my work is set.
I agree with that, actually. And I think there is this interesting, and we chatted about it briefly before too, speaking about this idea of the novel, of novelty and technological novelty specifically, when it comes to AI, which is, of course, the conversation of the moment, and everyone's talking about it. I think your work being about AI, but not necessarily using it as a tool of kind of artistic, creation, is a very important distinction, because you are I think a lot of work that centers on AI right now just ruminates on how cool the tech is. Like, isn't this technology interesting? It's so new. It's so spectacular. Look what it can do. But you're kind of operating at a level beyond that. You're operating at a level where you're kind of looking at the stakes of it, not just immediately, but also just like, these very far-flung stakes. And I think that is part of what makes your work so resonant, honestly. Do you see what you do as operating within this kind of like AI art landscape, or do you see yourself more as like a filmmaker who makes work about AI and other kinds of technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not really my. I obviously think about what I do a lot, but I feel it's not really my job to define what I'm doing in those terms. It's an interesting, because, for example, like artistic movements, let's say, most artistic movements are not coined by the artist, right? Sometimes they're coined by like a dealer and a collector who get together and want to, they want to canonize some stuff, so it rises in value and it has this like shared identity around it. I think to be honest as well, I have to be opportunistic, because there's no established market or like industry for what I'm doing. Like, there is a bit more now, but essentially I have to have like 7 side hustles. So sometimes, like on any given month, sometimes, I'm having great conversations like this in the museum, and other times I'm making like film pitch proposals or like some random meetings with, people who are also can't quite define what they're doing. And I think a couple of years ago, I also realized that it sounds obvious, but the price of doing something new is that, just from an artistic point of view, is that no model exists. And in the kind of art and technology space, and sometimes in the design space as well, there's often like the word prototype gets thrown around a lot. And I actually think that's, if I think a bit more critically, that's a misuse of the word prototype, because a prototype is like a step in a design process that wants to arrive at something that, a second version, or something that might be better, more mass produced, or might be more available more widely. Whereas what artists do is not a prototype. We're just experimenting and not knowing what the result will be. So as again, to go back to this idea of like new media artists, like new media is not that new, right? But new media, and it's still new art forms or new media always have to refer back to what there was before. So for example, in many museums, like new media or film gets put under photography. And back when they had to like find somewhere for photography to go, it kind of went under like prints, because it's a print, and then prints kind of go under drawing. But like a video game to a drawing is quite elite, but it just gets like band-aided on until this onto like old structures. So maybe back to what you're asking, it's like, yeah, I am both a filmmaker and a game designer, and also like video artist and installation artist. And when I describe the work I do, it's essentially like I try and think like what will the audience grasp onto, So let's say there's an installation with a video game and a film. So if it's a more like sculptural environment, then that's like the portal, that's the entry point. So I'm like, oh, I used to study architecture, and there's a pavilion there, and in the pavilion there's like a film there. So you kind of like zoom in each time, or it kind of frames it. And at other times I'm like, yeah, I'm a musician and video game artist, and sometimes I do installations. So it's really contextual, I guess.
Of course. And as we approach the end, unfortunately, of the conversation, I wanted to ask Lawrence, what are you working on now? What's on your mind? What's on the horizon for you?
I think a lot about not like the earlier series is kind of like 40 years in the future, and this is kind of looking at the near future. I suppose now I'm really thinking what's really happening like right now or in the very, very near future. So I'm working on a few projects. One of them is really I'm finishing my second feature film from 𝙉𝙊𝙓 actually. So what happens as well is I let's say with 𝙉𝙓, I made a Berlin version and version at the Hammer and a version here. And once I get a bit of time after the installations are done, I try and like put all of the video together into a feature film. So essentially this 5-day journey is being kind of like expanded into a film. So I'm working on that. And I'm working on a new series based on this like bad therapist, for a lack of a better term, who isn't really like interested in healing the vehicles, but that's more like a playful character, because I feel there's in this current series, the Smart City series, it's like all trying to keep a lid on like what's going wrong. And I feel right now there's a lot of, I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but there's like so much bad energy, right? And I think that just really says something. So this character is like this like malcontent character. A malcontent character is someone who's like dissatisfied about the state of the world. And I just feel that's kind of where my thoughts go right now.
That's exciting. I'm excited to see that when it's ready. So we're going to open it up to Q&A with the audience.
Hello. Thank you so much. This was great. And I really love your exhibit here. So for me, what I'm really interested in is, like we talked a lot about the social implications in 𝙉𝙊𝙓, which I think are fascinating. But I think for me, the thing that really draws me in is how you empathize with Enigma through the storytelling. And to empathize is sort of to identify with, right? So it brings up these questions for me about consciousness and the question of consciousness, and when these machines who sort of are designed to act like they're conscious become conscious, and like where are those lines? And I'm wondering if you think about that in your work at all, or just any kind of comments on that.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean, the idea of empathy and specifically like compassion is a really important part of the work as well. So, Claudia mentioned that 𝙖𝙬 is the Mandarin name for the Buddhist goddess of compassion. And I feel not just kind of drawn to this from a kind of, personal sensibility, but I really think that Buddhist logic is really interesting, because Buddhist logic is something that I think actually like I relate to, but also an AI might relate to, because the foundational things that are things like don't identify too much with your body. You are essentially in this endless cycle of karmic rebirth. In the case of an AI, that's like 10,000 generations a day, and basically don't be too tied to your mortal existence. And that's it. And then of course other like moral things. Sorry, not moral things, but compassionate things, that the logic goes that existence is suffering. The existence of a living thing is suffering because you will die. And the only thing that we can share in that, one of the most important things we can share in that, is this idea of like universal compassion. And actually, I think what's interesting is that there's no, in that logic, there's nothing that excludes non-human life from it, because of course, or animal life, or even machine life. And so that's why I thought that would be an appropriate figure for that. And the empathy, compassion side also, of course, as Claudia was mentioning too, has its sinister side, because you can have genuine compassion and you can have like manipulative compassion, right? In which they're just, gathering data on your like favorite color and, who your parents were and stuff like that. So that bureaucracy shadow side is absolutely there. But I really think that the, at least that Buddhist logic of compassion makes sense both as from a moral point of view, emotional point of view, as well as like a non-human kind of consciousness point of view. Yeah, thanks.
Are there any other questions? I have one more actually with someone in the audience. No, I have one more with relation actually to the Buddhism and reincarnation, about the crash test dummy character, dummy alpha, because of the kinds of implications of that, right? The kind of being in a kind of a figure that is designed to constantly be in a state of, I guess, trauma and repair. And that kind of, in a sense, relates to this idea of like rebirth, but without like enlightenment, perhaps, like this like purely mechanical like reincarnation, perhaps. So I don't know. Was that part of the reasoning of choosing a crash test dummy as this figure?
Yeah, I think so. So specifically with the crash test dummy, just sorry for the bad history lesson, but like, crash test dummies weren't created to save people. They were created to save companies from paying out insurance. And what's interesting, so I can't remember, I think a John O'Comfort video from many years ago, and there was it was a lot of slow motion footage, vintage footage of crash test dummies. And, they're always shot super slow motion. And even though with absolute certainty that they are not sentient beings, you can't help but feel immense sadness looking at these things get crushed, broken, and literally fished out, put back together again for the same thing to happen. So the really crazy thing for me, specifically with cars as well, is that, you've seen crash tests with cars, and isn't it cruel to think that the price of creating a sentient self-driving car would be just destroying tens of thousands of them? And even worse than that, as the car becomes more self-aware, they also become more self-aware of all the, generations of trauma on it. It's actually a really screwed up thing. So, so again, it's like an ethical thing, for a biological creature. Like, you feel pain, but if you yourself feel pain, you would like it to stop. But also, pain is a message for something to stop as well. So I think the question of like, is it right to create this feeling of pain in order to save the future? It's something very, very strange about it. And maybe just to go back into this fact that it's always been an eternal question, is that, like, countless religions have figures of like the martyr, the sacrificing God, the like, ritualized sacrifice of the young, the old, the king, the queen, in order to create this like endless cycle of rebirth. And I'm not saying my work is about that, but I think this idea of sacrifice really is really interesting. And I think it's super scary as well, because we would love to feel like we're angels and we got nothing to do with it. But, of course we do.
I want to ask a question. In your work, you often explore automation and the idea of AI becoming autonomous or even sentient. And in reality, Tesla or Waymo, that they say that they have like autonomous driving, but it is not real. It is like actually people living in somewhere else. But like Tesla operate through probabilistic prediction, yet they still struggle with human impulsiveness and edge cases. Do you see this gap between predictive automation and lived human unpredictability as a temporary technical problem, or as something more fundamental about machine perception? Like, what do you think about like your work and like Tesla and like actually how autonomous systems like actually like live, and like I don't know if do you understand my question?
Sure.
Okay.
So I mean, what I understand is essentially like current machine learning, which might include autonomous driving and let's say LLMs, ChatGPT, is probabilistic. So essentially what that means is, ChatGPT is not sentient. They're just doing great at guessing what word comes next, essentially. And self-driving cars aren't self-driving. They're just great at guessing if the road's like that, it's probably going to be kind of like that in the future. So what do you do about unpredictability in this, you're saying, edge cases? So in the case of my work is always about, like I say, like outcast, edge cases, like bad actors and so on. Because and I'll go on into the like more data-driven part of it, but I think what's really interesting narratively is that so many stories are about like a hero or protagonist, and almost always with the stories that we like most for some reason are by, outcasts, bad actors, anti-heroes who probably died for their like anti-hero like beliefs and so on. However, when we live in society, we generally would rather that be less, right? And that's obviously been formalized into like crime, right? In the modern age. How, and that is, I don't know whether that's a consequence of wanting something different, but it might also be a case of where the spotlight is put, because probably, I imagine like most things that are not, how should I put it, in society, most bad stuff doesn't happen because probably people self-censor ourselves before it can happen. In Christianity, there's this idea that you can't even think, you don't even not think the bad thought is like just as bad as doing the bad thought as well. So you just want to like cleanse, you want to bleach your like bad actorness if that's possible. But clearly it's not. So this isn't really an answer. It's just a reflection that why is it that stories are always about like the outcast? It's what makes it interesting, because otherwise, if you're just showing the generic like NPC or kind of like a background character, nothing happens. So why is it that stuff is only interesting or compelling when something unusual happens? And in screenwriting, there's a complete formula for how to make interesting stuff happen and how you create the hero. Of course, data science and machine learning has a completely different intention, right? Because the intention is not to create an interesting situation, because interesting situation means an accident, liability, or a crash in those cases, or like a bad college essay for ChatGPT. Like how do you? And so people complain that everything is so generic, right? You can spot things, ChatGPT and so on. Because there are cases where you do want novelty to look original, but not too much to people think you're crazy, but then too little and people like, this was just copied, So just even in cases where the stakes are lower, not when there's like a liability or life and death attached to it, like there's more variance. Variance is the term for like stuff outside the normal range. But I think that is the idea. Sorry, uniformity or difference is really such a political question, I think, because so much has been written about societies turning into essentially totalitarian regimes where everything should be uniform, including the individual, versus the end state of like libertarian individualism where everyone is a unique snowflake and expresses themselves like that. From a society point of view, I think obviously diversity is amazing, but from a management point of view, that's not desirable. So I think it's fascinating, completely unsolved, and maybe unsolvable. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Lawrence, and thank you everyone for joining us
One
this
question.
evening.
Sorry.
So,
Sorry, just one question.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. One thing that I was curious about, I love the landscapes and the design aesthetics that you've used within your exhibit. I was curious if you could share a little bit about the design platform that you used to create that artwork and to create the visuals and then the animations.
Sure. Thanks a lot. So it's like all of them. So basically I use in current projects, I use a video game engine called Unreal to create the animations and the video game. So in the exhibition, there's also a touchscreen based game. And so what I generally do is I kind of create like a virtual world inside a video game. So that's literally a video game. And from that, I make an animated film, which is what the films are, and then also the video game. And then for like a new edition, like I have here, I would create like sometimes in collaboration, in this case, in collaboration with a scenographer, 𝙉𝙊𝙓 𝙋𝙖𝙫𝙞𝙡𝙊𝙓. We would design a structure that kind of speaks to the context. So we were kind of thinking of like a half-built but abandoned Miami swimming pool, essentially. The steps, it's stone, but they kind of contractor ran out of money halfway through and just like left it. So that was kind of the design aesthetic of the structure. And so to add that structure is like, I would think, then I would essentially model that in Rhino. Rhino is like an industrial design 3D program, and then bring that into Unreal for it to be rendered. So in the exhibition, there's like the physical structure. There's a light box with the dummy, and the light box has the same physical structure but rendered. There's a video game, which was made from the game software, and there's the films. So I guess what I'm interested in is like, yeah, there's a kind of coherence there. And that's partly through the aesthetic and partly through the fact that like there's a motif, which is like this pavilion that is repeated in throughout the exhibition. Thanks.
Okay, this will be the last one.
Yeah.
Last one.
And thank you, Claudia and Lauren, for the talk. It's been really amazing. I think I'm just really inspired by the horses kind of coming into play. Like it was a really like nice surprise. And so I guess an inspiration, like how did that come about for you? Like, was it specific to this installation or other work? And then like, where does the human lie? Because you have the horse, you have the car, and like the horse feels humans, the car, like there's like a nature to it. And so I think the human is there even though you don't see it. And somehow the horse for me, like I relate a lot to the horse. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I was saying, like the horse, in many of the different work, I kind of have like a different animal that's there. So in Geomancer, this AI satellite who wants to be an artist, Geomancer is in space, and it doesn't really happen like this, but I was thinking about, again, actually sacrificial victim. And I thought about Laika. Laika was, the Soviet space dog who went up to space and died in space, but they were the first astronaut, right? So when Geomancer sees this cute dog, really, they think of how cruel it is, basically, that you have this icon, this astronaut, this like well-loved symbol of, technology and exploration, but they died as a result of that, and then they don't want to have that. So that's dog satellite. Then in Black Cloud, the surveillance system sees a fox in the city, and the fox is one of the things that makes the surveillance system, who can't go anywhere, think about, wouldn't it be amazing to be wild and free? So the fox represents like wildness, the spirit of nature. And in Nox, the horse represents, of course, like wildness and power and so on, but also a machine, because horses were only useful. Horses were and are very useful in transport, agriculture, and industry until the steam engine came along, and until the horseless carriage, and then cars came along, and then all the urban horses got killed off. You've seen old pictures of New York and stuff. So hundreds of thousands of animals just slaughtered and then turned into shoes and glue. So the horse for Enigma is, again, not just this beautiful therapy animal, but also a symbol of their future if they don't escape, basically. Yeah. So, but sorry, final thing. People often say to me, it's like, where are the humans? But as you're saying, it's like, I find it interesting that in the absence of like literal digital people, because of course in an animation they're not humans, they're just like polygons with 2 legs and 2 arms. But the moment you see a human, for me, in a video game, you kind of like switch mentality. You're thinking in a totally different way. Let's say you're playing a video game and you're like in an empty city, you're like exploring the city and it's all like cosmic and great. Then you see a person in the distance and then you think immediately, are they like friend or foe? You know, are they like an enemy? Are they an ally? Are they an NPC? Do they not matter? And all of a sudden it triggers this social dynamic. And in my work, I mean, clearly I'm interested in that, but not in that similar way. So I think as humans, we latch on to the closest thing. And in the project, the horse is the closest thing to a human. And then we see that as the avatar somehow. But I think it's actually quite magical that even though we all know it's digital, computer generated, it's a horse, it's a bunch of pixels and polygons, you still feel empathy towards that, you know? And I think that's quite a magical thing still, if you can feel a bit of emotion despite knowing at a fundamental level that it's all an illusion. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Really, it's amazing. Thank you all for being here.